If you sign that, you lose everything. The words didn't belong in a room like this, and yet they hung there, quiet, precise, impossible to ignore. The pen hovered just inches above the paper, a Mont Blanc worth more than most people's monthly rent, held between the steady fingers of Daniel Whitmore, CEO of Whitmore Capital, a man who had closed deals across 3 continents without hesitation. Conversation stopped. Glasses paused midair. Even the soft jazz drifting through the restaurant seemed to falter. Daniel didn't look up right away. He had learned long ago that interruptions were either irrelevant or dangerous. Slowly, he lifted his eyes. The woman standing beside the table wore a simple black uniform, her name tag catching the light. Emily Carter. A waitress. Nothing more. At least, that's what everyone in the room believed. Her posture was calm. Too calm. Not apologetic. Not nervous. Just still. Excuse me. Daniel's voice was low, controlled, the kind that didn't need to rise to command attention. Emily didn't flinch. She didn't repeat herself either. Instead, her gaze shifted briefly, not to him, but to the men seated across the table. 2 foreign investors. Impeccably dressed. Smiling just a little too easily. Then back to Daniel. "I'm sorry, sir," she said, her tone soft, professional. But her eyes didn't match the apology. They were focused, certain. Daniel studied her now, really studied her. There was no tremor in her hands. No uncertainty in her voice. That alone was unusual. Most people, when they realized who he was, adjusted. Became smaller. Careful. She hadn't. "Do you have something to add to this meeting?" One of the investors asked, his accent faint but noticeable, a polite smile stretched thin across his face. Emily didn't answer him. She kept her attention on Daniel. The room felt different now. Tighter. As if something invisible had shifted, just slightly out of place. Daniel leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking softly beneath him. He hadn't built a billion-dollar firm by ignoring instinct. And right now, his instinct wasn't telling him to dismiss her. It was telling him to pause. "Just for a second. You're interrupting a very important decision," he said, watching her carefully. Emily nodded once. "I know." A beat. Then, quieter. "That's why I said something." Around them, the city moved as it always did. Taxis passing, lights flickering against the glass windows, the hum of a world that never stopped. But at table 12, everything had narrowed to a single moment. A pen. A contract. A waitress who shouldn't have known anything, and yet clearly did. Daniel's fingers tightened slightly around the pen. Not signing. Not yet. Not until he understood why a single sentence, spoken in perfect calm, had just made him hesitate for the first time in years. Daniel did not sign. Not yet. The pen remained suspended between intention and instinct, and for the first time in years, the room was waiting on someone who was not him. He set the pen down slowly, the soft click against the table louder than it should have been. "Explain," he said, his voice calm, but edged with something sharper now. Emily did not move closer. She did not reach for the contract. Instead, she glanced once more at the 2 investors, then back to Daniel. "A few minutes ago," she said, "one of them used a word that does not belong in a negotiation like this." One of the men laughed lightly, a practiced sound. "I am afraid you must have misunderstood. Conversations in another language can sound unusual." Emily nodded as if she expected that response. "Yes," she said quietly. "But not that word." Daniel's gaze shifted to the investors. Their expressions were still composed, but something had changed. Just slightly. A fraction too controlled. "What word?" he asked. Emily hesitated for half a second, not out of doubt, but calculation. The word was paricot. It means transfer, but not in the way your contract defines it. One of the investors leaned forward, smiling again, though it no longer reached his eyes. "This is becoming inappropriate," he said. "Your employee is interrupting a confidential discussion with speculation." "She is not my employee," Daniel replied without looking at him. His attention stayed on Emily. "Continue." The restaurant seemed quieter now. Conversations in the distance blurred into a low hum, as if the world itself had stepped back to listen. Emily exhaled softly. "In legal Russian," she said, "that word can imply a forced transition of control. Not a partnership. Not a shared interest. A shift." Daniel's fingers tapped once against the table. A small movement. Controlled. But deliberate. "That is not what this contract says," the second investor added quickly, gesturing toward the document. Everything is clearly outlined in English. Emily's eyes moved to the contract for the first time. She did not touch it. She did not need to. Yes, she said. In English, it says strategic transfer of operational authority under mutual agreement. She paused. Then, quieter. But the way they used that word, it suggests something else. Something that happens after the agreement. Not within it. Silence followed. Not the comfortable kind. The kind that presses in. Daniel leaned forward slightly now, his attention fully engaged. You are saying the language they used does not match the language in the contract. I am saying, Emily replied, that they are not speaking about the same outcome you are reading. One of the investors shifted in his seat, just enough to notice. This is absurd, he said. You are taking a single word out of context. Emily met his gaze for the first time. Calm, unmoved. Then provide the context, she said. Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly. Not in anger. In focus. He had seen this before, of cooperation and mutual gain. And yet, something no longer aligned. He turned another page. Then another. The faint rustle of paper sounded sharper in the silence. Across the table, the investors remained still, but their stillness had changed. It was no longer relaxed. It was measured. This clause, Daniel said finally, tapping a section near the bottom of the page, defines the transfer conditions as conditional upon performance benchmarks. He looked up, his gaze landing on Emily for only a fraction of a second before shifting to the men across from him. There is no mention of forced transition. Exactly. One of them replied quickly, leaning forward with renewed confidence. Everything is transparent. Your team reviewed this for weeks. Daniel nodded once. That was true. His legal team had spent over 300 hours analyzing every line, every phrase, every implication. Nothing had raised concern. Until now. He leaned back slightly, his fingers steepled in front of him. A habit. A signal. He was thinking, not reacting. Then let us clarify something simple, Daniel said, his tone even. When you used that word, what exactly were you referring to? The question landed softly, but it carried weight. The first investor smiled again, though it came a second too late. We were discussing internal projections, he said. Future operational shifts that may occur as the partnership evolves. Emily's gaze did not leave his face. That is not how the word is used in that context, she said quietly. The second investor's jaw tightened, just slightly. With respect, he replied, you are not part of this negotiation. No, Emily said. I am not. A pause. Then, just as steady. That is why I can hear what others ignore. The air shifted again. Subtle, but undeniable. Daniel's eyes returned to the contract. But this time, he was not reading the words. He was reading between them. Patterns. Structures. What was said, and what was not. He flipped back to the earlier pages, scanning faster now, connecting fragments. There it was. A clause buried in section 14. Harmless on its own. Routine, even. But paired with the language Emily had identified, it changed. Not visibly. Not to someone who was not looking for it. But to someone who was, it opened a door. A quiet one. The kind that does not slam shut. The kind that closes slowly, after you have already stepped through. Daniel's fingers stopped moving. He read the line again. Then once more. This provision, he said, almost to himself, allows for expedited restructuring under external advisement. One of the investors nodded quickly. Standard language, he said, to ensure flexibility in volatile markets. Daniel's gaze lifted, sharp now, focused in a way that made people uncomfortable without understanding why. External advisement, he repeated. Defined by whom? A flicker. Barely there. But enough. Emily saw it. Daniel saw it too. The answer came, but it was no longer immediate. By a mutually agreed third party, the investor said, as outlined in Appendix C. Daniel did not look at Appendix C. Not yet. Instead, he leaned back fully in his chair, the leather creaking softly, and for a moment, he said nothing at all. The silence stretched. Not awkward. Not uncertain. Deliberate. He turned his head slightly, just enough to meet Emily's eyes again. Not as a waitress. Not as an interruption. But as a variable he had not accounted for. You said the decision had already been made, he said quietly. What makes you so sure? Emily held his gaze. Calm. Unwavering. Because, she said, they were not asking if you would sign. A beat. They were talking about what happens after you do. The silence did not break this time. It deepened. Daniel did not move, but something in him had already shifted. The contract lay open in front of him, no longer a document of opportunity, but a puzzle missing a piece he had not known to look for. He reached for the glass of water beside him, took a slow sip, then set it back down with careful precision. Control. Always control. Appendix C, he said quietly, turning the page at last. The paper slid beneath his fingers, revealing a dense block of text most executives would have delegated to legal teams without a second thought. But Daniel read it himself now. Every word, every comma. Across the table, the investors exchanged a glance. Quick, almost invisible, but not invisible enough. Emily saw it. She did not speak. She did not need to. The room was already listening to her silence. Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly as he reached the final paragraph. There it was again. Language that looked harmless. Technical. Standard. But paired with the earlier clause, it formed something else. Not a statement. A mechanism. The advisory authority, Daniel read aloud, may assume temporary operational oversight in the event of strategic misalignment. He stopped, just for a second, then looked up. Define misalignment. The first investor leaned back, folding his hands with practiced ease. A difference in execution strategy, he said smoothly. Nothing more. Daniel held his gaze. Defined by whom? A pause. Slightly longer this time. By the advisory authority, the man replied. The words landed. Clean, simple, and wrong. Daniel leaned back again, slower now, the chair giving a quiet creak beneath him. He was no longer reading the contract. He was reconstructing it, piece by piece, intent by intent. So let me understand this correctly, he said, his voice still calm, but colder now. I signed this agreement. Your advisory firm, which is listed here as a neutral third party, gains the ability to define misalignment. And once that is defined, he did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. The answer was already in front of him. And for the first time, the investors did not rush to fill the silence. Emily watched his expression change. Not dramatically, not visibly to most, but she saw it. The moment when certainty became awareness. When control met something it had not anticipated. Daniel closed the contract. Not forcefully, just enough to signal that he was done reading for now. His fingers rested on the cover, tapping once. Then still. You structured this very carefully, he said, almost thoughtfully. It would pass every standard review, every surface-level analysis. Neither man responded. Daniel's gaze shifted, slowly, deliberately, back to Emily. Except, he continued, for one word that was never meant to be heard. Emily met his eyes. Steady, unshaken. People reveal more in the language. They think no one understands, she said softly. A faint sound came from one of the investors. Not quite a sigh, not quite a breath. Something in between. The kind of sound a person makes when a plan begins to slip, not all at once, but enough to feel it. Daniel stood. Not abruptly, not dramatically, just decisively. The kind of movement that changes the direction of a room without raising a voice. Gentlemen, he said, adjusting the cuff of his sleeve, his tone returning to its usual measured authority. It seems we are not discussing the same agreement after all. The first investor opened his mouth to respond, but Daniel raised a hand slightly. Not aggressive, not dismissive, just final. I think it would be best if we paused here, he said, until every word means exactly what it appears to mean. The pen remained on the table, unused, and for the first time since the meeting began, it was clear to everyone in the room that it would stay that way. The meeting ended without another word. Chairs shifted softly against the polished floor, the kind of restrained movement that carried more tension than any raised voice ever could. The investors stood, offering polite nods that no longer held the same confidence as before. Their smiles remained, but they felt thinner now, stretched over something unsettled. Daniel did not offer his hand. He did not escort them out. He simply watched as they gathered their documents, their briefcases, their composure, and walked away from a deal that had been, just minutes ago, inevitable. The moment the door closed behind them, the air changed. Not lighter, just honest again. Daniel remained standing for a second longer, then exhaled slowly and reached for the contract once more. He flipped it open, scanning the same pages, but now with clarity instead of assumption. It was all there, hidden in plain sight. Not illegal, not obvious, just intentional. He closed it again, this time with certainty. Across from him, the empty chairs seemed to hold the outline of what could have happened. A signature, a transfer, a slow loss disguised as strategy. He turned slightly, his gaze landing on Emily, who had already stepped back to her original position beside the table, her hands loosely folded, her expression neutral once more, as if nothing unusual had occurred. As if she had not just altered the trajectory of a company worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Emily, he said. Her name sounded different now. Not a label. A recognition. She looked at him, calm as before. Yes, sir. There was no pride in her voice. No expectation. Just the same quiet steadiness. Daniel studied her for a moment, longer than he had allowed himself earlier. Walk with me, he said. It was not a request, but it was not a command either. It was something in between. She nodded once. They moved away from the table, past the soft glow of the dining room lights, toward a quieter corner near the tall windows overlooking the city. Outside, traffic moved in steady lines, headlights stretching into the distance like something continuous, something predictable. Inside, everything had just changed. Daniel stopped near the glass, his reflection faint against the night skyline. He did not speak immediately. He was not a man who filled silence without purpose. Where did you learn that? He asked finally. Emily did not answer right away. Her gaze shifted briefly to the city outside, then back to him. I used to work with contracts like that, she said. Simple. Direct. Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly. Used to. A small pause. Yes. He waited. She did not elaborate. The silence stretched, but it was not uncomfortable. It was measured. Deliberate. Daniel turned fully toward her now, studying not just her words, but the way she carried them. There was no hesitation. No need to prove anything. That alone told him more than any explanation could. You realized what they were doing from a single word, he said. Not just the word, Emily replied. The timing. The way it was said. The way they assumed no one would understand. Daniel nodded slowly. That matched what he had seen. The glance. The pause. The slight shift in tone. Details most people missed. Details he usually did not. And yet, today he had. He let out a quiet breath. Almost a laugh, though it carried no humor. 300 hours of legal review, he said. And it comes down to a waitress overhearing a conversation. Emily did not react to the word waitress. She simply met his gaze. It came down to someone listening, she said. The words settled between them. Simple. Undeniable. Daniel looked at her for a long moment, then nodded once. Not in agreement. In acknowledgement. You just saved me from making a very expensive mistake, he said. Emily's expression did not change. You chose not to sign, she replied softly. A beat. Then, just as quiet. That was your decision. Daniel held her gaze. And for the first time that evening, there was something in his eyes that had not been there before. Not control. Not calculation. Respect. Daniel did not look away immediately. Respect, for him, was not something he offered lightly, and even less often did he show it without calculation. But this moment did not feel calculated. It felt earned. He nodded once more, then shifted his gaze toward the city beyond the glass. The reflection of lights stretching across the dark like a map of decisions, each one leading somewhere irreversible. Most people in that room would have stayed silent, he said after a moment. It was not my decision to stay silent, Emily replied. Her tone remained even, but there was something deeper beneath it now. Miss, you speak when it matters, and you do not hesitate when the cost of silence is too high. Emily considered that. The words were accurate, but accuracy was not the same as understanding. She reached out at last, but instead of taking the card, she gently pushed it back toward him. That is not why I am here, she said. No apology. No hesitation. Just a quiet boundary. Daniel's hand stilled for a fraction of a second, then he lowered it slowly, the card returning to his palm. Rejection was not something he encountered often. Not in business. Not in life. But this did not feel like rejection. It felt like alignment. Different priorities. Different paths. Then why are you here? He asked. The question was not sharp. It was genuine. Emily glanced briefly toward the dining room, where another table had just been seated, menus being unfolded, conversations beginning again as if nothing extraordinary had happened just moments before. Because this is where I chose to be, she said. Daniel followed her gaze, taking in the quiet rhythm of the restaurant, the small interactions that most people overlooked. A glass refilled, A chair adjusted. A nod exchanged. Simple things, but intentional. He looked back at her. You had the ability to be somewhere else, he said. Somewhere with more influence. Emily's expression softened, just slightly. Not with emotion. With clarity. Influence is not always where people think it is, she replied. The words lingered. Daniel exhaled slowly, then slipped the card back into his holder without another attempt to insist. He understood something now that he had not before. Not everything valuable could be moved. Not everything important could be bought. A server passed behind them, carrying a tray of drinks, the quiet motion grounding the moment back into reality. The world had not stopped. It had simply revealed something. Daniel adjusted his sleeve again, a subtle habit returning as his mind recalibrated. If you ever change your mind, he said, not as a push, but as a door left open, that offer stands. Emily nodded once. I know. There was no promise in her voice, but there was no dismissal either, just acknowledgement. Daniel studied her for one last moment, then gave a slight nod, the kind that closed a conversation without ending its impact. As he turned to leave, he paused briefly, just enough to say one more thing without looking back. You did not raise your voice, he said, but you changed the outcome. Emily watched him for a second, then returned her attention to the dining room, picking up a menu, stepping back into her role as if nothing had shifted at all. But something had. Not in the room, not in the city outside, in the way one man now understood the difference between power and perception. The rhythm of the restaurant returned, but not quite the same. Conversations resumed, glasses clinked softly, and the low hum of voices filled the space again. Yet something invisible had shifted beneath it all. Daniel Whitmore walked toward the exit with measured steps, his posture unchanged, his presence still commanding, but his mind no longer where it had been an hour ago. The contract was no longer just a near mistake. It had become a mirror. As he reached the door, his phone vibrated in his pocket. He paused, glanced at the screen, and saw a message from his legal team asking if the deal had been finalized. His thumb hovered over the reply. Then he typed just 3 words. Not moving forward. He sent it without hesitation, then slipped the phone back into his pocket. Outside, the night air was cool, carrying the distant sound of traffic and the steady pulse of a city that never stopped negotiating, never stopped deciding. But inside, at table 12, the decision had already been made differently. Back in the dining room, Emily moved between tables with the same quiet efficiency as before. She refilled a glass, adjusted a fork slightly to the left, offered a brief, polite smile to a couple seated near the window. Nothing in her movements suggested that she had just redirected the course of a 9-figure agreement. To everyone else, she was exactly what she appeared to be. A waitress. Nothing more. And yet, not nothing at all. At the service station, another server leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. What was that about? She asked, glancing toward the now empty table, where the meeting had taken place. Emily picked up a tray, aligning the glasses with careful precision. A conversation, she said simply. The server raised an eyebrow. Looked like more than that. Emily gave a small, almost unnoticeable smile. Most things are, she replied. She lifted the tray and moved back onto the floor, the weight balanced effortlessly in her hands, her focus already on the next table, the next moment, the next detail that others might overlook. Across the room, the manager stood near the entrance, speaking quietly with a host, his eyes occasionally drifting toward Emily with a look that carried curiosity he had not yet put into words. He had seen enough to know something unusual had happened, but not enough to understand it, and perhaps not enough to ask. The door opened again briefly as a gust of cool air slipped inside, then closed, sealing the warmth of the restaurant back into place. Outside, Daniel paused beside his car for a moment longer than necessary. He looked back through the glass, his eyes scanning the room until they found her again. Emily did not notice. Or perhaps she did, and chose not to show it. Either way, she did not change what she was doing. That, more than anything, held his attention. Most people, after a moment like that, would have looked up, waited, expected something. Recognition. Reward. She did not. She simply continued, as if the value of what she had done did not depend on who saw it. Daniel opened the car door, then stopped. Just for a second. He looked back once more, then gave a small nod to no one in particular, as if acknowledging a lesson he had not expected to learn tonight. Then he got in, the door closing with a soft, final sound. The car pulled away from the curb, merging into the flow of the city, another vehicle among thousands. Inside the restaurant, Emily set down the tray at table 7 and poured water into a glass, the liquid catching the light for a brief second before settling. Calm, clear, unremarkable. And yet, everything about this night would remain long after the glasses were cleared, the tables reset, and the lights dimmed. Because sometimes, the moment that changes everything does not look like a moment at all. The night stretched on, but the moment did not fade. It settled, quietly, like something understood rather than remembered. Hours later, the restaurant began to slow, the steady rhythm softening as tables emptied and conversations thinned into scattered murmurs. The lights dimmed slightly, casting longer shadows across the polished floor. Emily stood at the service station, folding a linen napkin with careful precision, her movements unhurried, almost meditative. The same hands that had held a tray now moved with the same quiet control, as if nothing about her had changed. And yet, something had. Not on the surface. Beneath it. The manager approached, his steps measured, his expression thoughtful in a way that suggested he had been replaying the evening in his mind. "Emily," he said, stopping a few feet away. She looked up, attentive as always. "Yes." He hesitated, just briefly, then glanced toward the corner where the meeting had taken place. "That table earlier, the CEO? Daniel Whitmore." She nodded once. "What about him?" The manager studied her, as if expecting more. "Some reaction. Some story. You seem to know what you were talking about," he said carefully. Emily folded the last corner of the napkin, smoothing it flat with the palm of her hand. "I listened," she replied. He exhaled softly, a faint smile forming as he shook his head. "You always do." There was no accusation in his tone, just observation. He lingered for a second longer, then gave a small nod and walked away, leaving the question unasked. Because some answers were not meant to be explained. Emily placed the folded napkin onto the stack, aligning it perfectly with the others. Outside, the city lights flickered against the glass, steady and distant. Inside, the last few guests finished their meals, unaware of the quiet shift that had taken place hours earlier. The door opened again, but this time, no wind followed. Just a man in a dark coat stepping inside, his presence subtle, almost deliberate in its restraint. Daniel Whitmore. He did not walk with urgency. He did not scan the room like someone looking for attention. He simply stepped in, closed the door behind him, and paused. The restaurant was different now. Quieter. More honest. His eyes moved across the space until they found her. Emily did not look up immediately. She was clearing a table, stacking plates with the same calm efficiency as before. For a moment, he simply watched. Not as a CEO, not as a man evaluating, just observing. Then he stepped forward. When she finally looked up, there was no surprise in her expression, only recognition. "You came back," she said softly. Daniel nodded once. "I did." A brief silence settled between them, not awkward, not uncertain. Familiar, in a way neither of them had expected. "I had my team review the contract again," he said. "They found it. Exactly where you said it would be." Emily held his gaze, her expression unchanged. "It was always there," she replied. "They just were not looking for it." Daniel gave a faint, almost reflective smile. "Neither was I." He paused, then reached into his coat, not for a business card this time, but for something else. A folded document. He placed it gently on the table between them. "This is a revised agreement," he said. "One we are drafting with a different firm. Transparent. Clear. Every word aligned." Emily glanced at the document, but did not open it. "And?" she asked. Daniel met her eyes. "And I wanted you to see it," he said. "Not to approve it. Not to work for me. A beat. Just to know that what you said mattered." The words were simple, but they carried weight. Not because of who said them, because of how they were said. Emily looked at the document for a moment longer, then back at him. "It was your decision," she said again, just as she had before. Daniel nodded. "Yes," he said quietly. "But it was your voice that made me pause." The restaurant remained still around them, the final moments of the night settling into something almost peaceful. No applause, no recognition, just a conversation between two people who understood something most never noticed. That sometimes, the smallest interruption, is the only thing standing between certainty and truth. Emily finally picked up the document. Not quickly, not with curiosity, with the same steady intention she had shown. All night, her fingers unfolded the pages, the soft sound of paper breaking the silence just enough to mark the moment. Daniel did not speak. He did not explain. He simply stood there, watching, not for approval, but for understanding. Emily's eyes moved across the lines, not rushing, not skimming, reading, the way she always did, looking for what was said and what was not. The language was clean, direct, no layered meanings, no hidden mechanisms disguised as cooperation, just clarity. She turned the final page, then closed the document gently, her hand resting on top of it for a brief second before lifting away. It says what it means, she said. Daniel exhaled softly, a breath he had not realized he was holding. It does. A small pause followed. Then Emily slid the document back toward him, not rejecting it, not claiming it, just returning it to where it belonged. Then it is enough, she added. Daniel nodded once. Not as a businessman, as someone who understood the weight of that sentence. Enough was not something he had heard often in his world. It was always more. More control, more leverage, more certainty. But tonight had been different. Tonight had shown him that more was not always better. Sometimes, more was just hidden. A quiet sound came from the dining room as the last table stood to leave, chairs sliding back, voices lowering as coats were gathered and bills settled. The night was ending. The kind of ending that did not announce itself, but simply arrived. Emily reached for a cloth and began wiping down the table, her movements returning to routine, to something grounded and real. The document no longer held her attention. It never had. Daniel watched her for a moment, then spoke, his voice lower now, less defined by position and more by thought. You could have walked away, he said. Said nothing. Let it happen. Emily did not stop what she was doing. Yes, she replied. I could have. He studied her, waiting for more. She set the cloth down, straightened slightly, then looked at him. But I would have known, she said. The words were simple, but they carried something deeper than explanation. Daniel nodded slowly. That, more than anything, made sense. Not obligation, not opportunity, just knowing. He glanced once more at the document in his hand, then folded it carefully, placing it back into his coat. Not as a tool, as a reminder. Thank you, he said. No titles, no distance, just 2 words, spoken without weight. And because of that, they mattered more. Emily gave a small nod, acknowledging the words without holding on to them. You are welcome. The lights dimmed slightly again, signaling closing time. The manager moved through the room, checking tables, locking the entrance behind the last departing guest. The restaurant grew still. Daniel took a step back, then another, creating space where there had been conversation. Good night, Emily, he said. She met his gaze one last time. Good night, Mr. Whitmore. He turned, walking toward the door, his steps quieter now, less about presence and more about direction. This time, when he reached the exit, he did not pause. He opened the door, stepped out into the cool night, and disappeared into the city that had shaped him. Inside, Emily finished resetting the table, aligning the silverware, smoothing the cloth, leaving everything exactly as it should be. No trace of what had happened. No sign of what had almost happened. Just order. Calm. Silence. She stepped back, glanced once at the empty table, then turned off the light above it. And in that quiet darkness, one truth remained, simple and unchanged. The loudest power in the room had been the one that spoke only once.